Broad overview of special education. In this presentation, we will cover the history and definition of special education, as well as a few laws and policies, person-first language, the difference between the terms impairment, disability, and handicap, and finally we'll close with the different categories of disabilities. First, let's start with the history. People with special abilities have been documented even as early as Greek and Roman times, all the way till present day. Unfortunately, many times people with disabilities were treated badly and sometimes even put to death. Some cultures believed people with special abilities were monsters, or they were turned into jokers, jesters, or clowns to be laughed at. Some were assumed to be dangerous or possessed with evil spirits or demons. Others believed maybe they were cursed by the gods or that they were witches, and if something was wrong and they couldn't be cured, it had to be caused by evil. Then there was another culture, the Greek culture. They believed that blind men were seers and they were actually considered to be wise. It's very unfortunate that the majority of people with special abilities in earlier times were often killed or destroyed. They were excluded from the population. Sometimes they were pitied and protected by being placed into charitable centers, or they were just segregated from the community, institutionalized, and often ignored, exiled, exploited, or neglected. The definition of special education. Special education means specially designed instruction that meets the needs of an exceptional student. Some possible forms of special education include special materials, such as colored paper, larger font size, and a variety of other accommodations and modifications. There's also specialized teaching techniques, such as differentiated instruction, explicit or direct instruction, prompts and cues, and many more. You may use specialized equipment and/or facilities, such as an FM radio, communication boards, and other forms of technology. There's also related services, such as speech and language services. Some laws and policies. In order to initiate many of the laws and policies that are in place today all over the world, there was a disability rights movement. The goals of this movement was for accessible public transportation, community-based independent living support services, mobility skills training, adequate housing, appropriate medical care, communication access and aids, and appropriate and adequate employment. In the United Arab Emirates, there is the UAE Disability Act, which is UAE Federal Law 29/2006. The Disability Act requires public and private schools to provide equal access to all children. Furthermore, no school in the UAE can refuse the admission of a child solely based on the child's disability. Teachers and therapists working with students who have disabilities must have a university degree recognized by the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research and a teaching permit issued by the Ministry of Education. In 2009, the UAE Federal Law 29/2006 was amended to be more specific towards education and was renamed the UAE Federal Law 14/2009. Special needs are not considered an obstacle in joining any educational institution, government or private. Students can be taught in the regular classroom with the appropriate accommodations and modifications. The UAE Federal Law 29/2006 and the amendment, which is UAE Federal Law 14/2009, reinforced school for all with no barriers for anyone. Person-first language. When addressing or speaking about people who have disabilities, we want to always remember to put the person first. People are not their condition or their disease. They are individual human beings. For example, a person is not an epileptic, but rather a person who has epilepsy. First and foremost, they are people, so we always put the person first. Only secondary do they have one or more disabling conditions. So we prefer to speak with people with respect and use the person first. So they are people with disabilities, students with special needs, or here in the UAE, we say people of determination or students of determination. Now let's look at the difference between the terms impairment, disability, and handicap. An impairment is defined as an abnormality of a structure or function. So basically, the impairment is the structure that is not functioning correctly. For example, if you have an abnormality of the ear or auditory system, then part of the ear is not working correctly. That is the impairment. When we look at the term disability, disability is the functional consequence of an impairment. So your inability to hear because of your ear parts not working correctly would be the disability. Your inability to hear certain sounds or inability to speak clearly results from the impairment. Finally, we have handicap. And a handicap is the social consequence of impairment. Isolation, loss of job, or having to make career changes as a result of communication difficulties because the parts of the ear are not working correctly, which lead to an inability to hear certain sounds or an inability to speak clearly. The handicap is the social aspect, or what happens within the environment that causes your impairment to cause an issue. Let's look at a couple examples. So, an impairment, looking at this picture, is the physical structure or the function of the legs. So the child here in the picture is using crutches. His impairment is that his legs are not working correctly or they're abnormal. So this is the impairment. The disability, which is the functional consequence, he needs the crutches in order to be able to walk. So his disability is his need for the crutches because his legs are working abnormally. And his social consequence, which is the handicap, what would be the social consequences of needing to use crutches? Perhaps you need to use the elevator instead of taking an escalator or the stairs. Another social consequence may be it may be hard for this child to play football or other sports with his friends on the playground. This is what causes him to have a handicap. Now let's close with the categories of disabilities. There are 12 to 13 categories of disabilities, and here we'll have 12. 1, intellectual disabilities. 2, specific learning disabilities, which can include dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and 4 others. There's emotional behavioral disorders, speech or language impairments, visual impairments, hard of hearing, which is also called a hearing impairment, orthopedic impairments, other health impairments. There's deaf and blindness, there's multiple disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and traumatic brain injury. Now going back to what we just learned about impairment, disability, and handicap, you'll notice that there's speech and language impairments, visual impairments, hard of hearing, or hearing impairments. They're called impairments because there is something not functioning in regards to speech or language. Something isn't functioning correctly with the eyes, which causes a visual impairment. They're not called a visual disability because the disability is caused from the visual impairment. I know it can get a little confusing, but hopefully this is making a little more sense. So just to recap, we talked about the history of special education, which included the mistreatment of people with disabilities from the earlier times. We talked about the definition, some of the laws and policies, mainly here in the United Arab Emirates. We discussed person-first language and respecting individuals who have disabilities by using person-first language rather than identifying them by their disability. And then we looked at the differences between impairment, disability, and handicap. And finally, we closed with the categories of disabilities. That was our broad overview of special education.